So to start with, we'll go through this sort of quick BOTEC from Tom Davidson and Rose Hadchar just from this month or last month on how quickly you might expect growth to accelerate in the event of full automation in both sectors, or at least growth substitution between the factors in both sectors. And the way their BOTEC works, they ask, okay, first off, how big would the level effect be if we had true AGI, that is, AI systems that could automate all cognitive work whatsoever, but had not yet automated R&D? They propose that it would be kind of on the order of one order of magnitude, just by getting everyone up to the sort of level of cognitive and organizational and so forth performance that you currently see in current best practices. All right. So they have sources for all these points. You can click on the link and look into them. But in jobs involving manual labor, they find that the most productive workers in a given firm are maybe 1.5 to 2 times as productive as the average. So if that added productivity comes with just like organizing how you spend your time better and so on, rather than just like having bigger muscles to lift lift more bricks at once, then you just give everyone the headsets, they tell them what to do with their arms at a given point in time, and you kind of doubled everyone's productivity. Likewise, if how well a firm is run is not some complex feature of like how the whole org chart has evolved over time, that maybe no one even knows the details of how the whole firm is run, but just like the best run firms happen to have been selected for. Putting that aside, if it's just a matter of how good the instructions are from the managers to the lower level employees and from the CEOs to the managers to the middle managers and so forth, then by stipulation they can put on their headsets, they can ask their super intelligent chatbots, and you'll get everyone up to best practices, and sort of within a given narrow industry, the best run firms are on the order of 3 times more productive than the average. And then finally, because all cognitive work's been automated in this scenario, everyone, like all of us, can just go into using our arms rather than our brains, right? So you just get this switch. Now, all of these can involve lags. We have to actually produce all the headsets. We have to actually change our jobs and retrain to do the manual labor that is now the thing that's in scarce supply. But at least once the level effect has been fully incorporated, maybe it would be something like a factor of 10. As I was saying, this puts aside various frictions, including, say, the latent knowledge that comes, or also, I should have said the tacit knowledge that comes with doing a job for a while and knowing the ins and outs of it in ways that you haven't written down anywhere. But I think this is also basically just transitional, right? Because if you're really imagining a world where all of the sensory data that we pick up that teach us how to do our jobs better over time is also being fed into a system that's learning, learning from the data the way that we would, then after like one generation or one job training cycle's worth of you kind of incorporating this data throughout the economy, you're going to get the level effect that they're talking about. Does that kind of make sense? So that's their kind of step one. So like, okay, after one generation of pure AGI, you get growth just through that. Step 2 is we're going to relieve the like production bottleneck by greatly expanding the quantity of humanoid robots. So you can ask, okay, well, how fast would this population of bots be growing? Maybe could someone just get the door? It's not like a secret or anything. I just feel like I don't the that's what the serving rest of the bill. Okay. So at first, assuming the sort of break-even condition that we start actually building these bots once it becomes profitable to do so. In some sense, it's got to work out that each bot will, in the first kind of iteration, each will be producing, say, like 0.07 bots per year after depreciation, if that's like the prevailing interest rate at the time. Does that make sense? Because if you have some outside option, some way to turn capital now into capital later at that rate, you can take a hunk of capital now and turn it into 1.07 units later by investing it. And even if it's not the same stuff, you can sell it and buy, 7% more of the stuff that you had at the beginning. So if that's the interest rate, there's no sense making a bot that can do less than that. So this is how fast eventually maybe we get to octopus level where they're kind of creating 250,000 copies of themselves every year. But at the start, they'll be creating the interest rate, many copies of themselves. But they have an argument for why that kind of feasible replication rate might rapidly rise to around 100% a year. Meaning that, for instance, the growth rate would be rising to 20% per year if we have like a savings rate of 20%. And the argument is that manual laborers in the US currently earn around $40,000 a year. And that if we haven't, kind of made use of any of the like new opportunities that AGI could unlock or that, that superintelligence could unlock, but we're keeping all of our factories organized the same way and just sort of swapping out manual laborers for robots, maintaining the org chart as it is. We kind of have this existence proof that the bots can just do what manual laborers are currently doing, but presumably they don't need to sleep or take time off. And so like just on the margin, right, as they're being introduced, they should be earning something like $240,000 a year. Makes sense? Twice as productive because they are getting this advantage, right? They're going to be the most productive. Like we just copy the patterns of behavior that's the most productive manual work. And the cost of a roughly humanoid bot today is about $200,000. That means that the payback time is about 1 year. Now, of course, we don't actually have bots today that can do very much that's useful at all. But on at least some stories, and which they sort of endorse, and I think are not crazy, the main reason why our current bots aren't great substitutes for workers is the software. The main bottleneck is not like the ability to create opposable thumbs that kind of have the full sort of degree of rotation that our thumbs have and so on. It's that we don't have the software to direct them to pick up objects and manipulate them as flexibly and dexterously as people can. So if we had that, either just because that's kind of what we mean by AGI, or if AGI let us kind of develop that quickly with after gathering enough data on manipulating objects and sort of with like kind of, data on how they move when we touch them in detail. The physical equipment of the bot shouldn't cost too much more than $200,000 and sort of just adding one working 24/7 would be earning about $240,000 a year. All right. So the first ones we introduce will be kind of reproducing at the interest rate. There's no knowing what the interest rate will be. It could rise a lot by the time that we're introducing them. But if it starts out low, that could be perhaps because the failure rates are really high, the depreciation rate's really high. And then it'll rise at least to kind of a 100% replication rate per year. And how fast it rises will depend on, how quickly the learning curve unfolds or whatever. But anyway, so that's step 2. It's all very sketchy, but you kind of get the shape of the argument. And then step 3 is to ask how how high could the hyperbola go? So we know the shape of the, using our kind of familiar functional forms, how fast they can self-replicate will rise over time, because that's just A, and we'll kind of do our directed technological development. Now kind of all the money is in pushing up A, because capital is substituting for labor. And you could worry that, yeah, sure, technically you've got a hyperbola. So yeah, technically if you let it rip, A will rise and rise, and you'll get really fast self-replication eventually. But you start out at the interest rate. This is A, how many robots a robot can build in a year. Starts out at 0.07, but it rises and rises as we work out all the kinks, and eventually it equals 1. So each bot costs just 240K, right? If it's making 240K a year, it costs 240K to make one, if each one takes a year to build one. But in the time it took to get there, we already filled much of the earth with robots, and by the time A is at 10, let alone 50 or 100 or something, there's so many bots, we're so far up that hyperbolic curve that there's just not room for them on the face of the earth, or it costs more energy to run them than the sunlight hitting the earth or the heat we know we can dissipate from the earth. So in practice, we never actually get to that really, really fast growing world. We'll just hit natural resource constraints first. That really, really fast growing world. And the growth rate will just sort of be slowed down by natural resource constraints. So that's kind of the background worry that they're going to try to dispel. Not worry, but objection. The argument is the Earth is currently receiving energy from the sun at a rate of 2 times 10 to the 17 watts. Watts a measure of energy per unit time. And the human body uses about 100 watts. And so you can just say, okay, on different estimates of this curvature, right, they're assuming no resource constraint except for the ceiling. So it's like alpha equals 1. You get like robots building robots 1 for 1 until you get like an energy ceiling. Okay, so the only question about how steep this curve is how quickly ideas get harder to find and how parallelizable research is. It's just going to be covered by the landscape. Right. If you built in a natural resource constraint, it would be like lambda over beta plus 1 by itself. The same we've seen before. The overall degree of return is the same. But so on different estimates of the lambda over beta, they ask how, if we sort of fill the Earth to capacity so that these humanoid bots, just as efficient as the human body, were using as much energy as there is sunlight hitting the Earth, how quickly would they be self-replicating? Like, what would their maximum feasible doubling time be? What would A be once we hit that kind of energy constraint ceiling? And across the range, their range is like A being 100 at the lower end to A being like 30 million at the upper end. So octopuses was 250,000.
Not the self-replicating bots and how long it takes to pay them off. Is the idea, say you take a country which is a 10th or 20th of manual labor wages in the US, is the idea that you just look, the US does its first, we move up to go fast enough that like the bot get cheap enough that like in a couple of years time, this pays.
Yep, that's exactly what the theory would predict. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, incidentally, I kind of mentioned this before, maybe, or no, sorry, I'll mention this next week. But a worry that some have expressed, including like Anton Kornick and Joseph Stiglitz, is that this will really slow the process of, or reverse the process of wage growth in the developing world, because now we won't be outsourcing our labor there to where it's cheap. We'll just kind of be using the cheap robots that we can build, and then eventually we'll be exporting them, or like the multinationals will not be hiring locals abroad. They'll just be using bots there. Yeah. So there's this exercise you can run through if you like, just looking at what a given set of parameters and a given initial interest rate imply for, you know, how many bots will have to accumulate by the time that we've gotten to really fast potential growth, and you know, as a consequence, how quickly we'll be growing at the time that we start running up against those constraints. Yeah, this talk about like self-replication shouldn't be taken too literally. Indeed, technological progress to date has generally not been about increasing the replication rate of capital at all. It's been about, creating new capital goods or new consumption goods that could do new things, as has come up more than once. So you might think that this lambda over beta that we get by looking at the economy-wide relationship between research inputs and productivity outputs is just no guide at all to how quickly ideas get harder to find in the domain of speeding self-replication. It's sort of comparing apples and oranges. And I think that's a fair point. But we actually do, we have something a little bit closer to home because we have all this data on like the experience curves for particular goods like solar panels and stuff. And there you typically find a lambda over beta that's higher than a third. We saw actually in the case of like Moore's law, right? A lambda over beta was much higher than that. That's not exactly an experience curve, but the point is the product level estimates of the rate at which it gets harder to make progress over time tend to be lower. And at the economy level, you're slowed down by the fact that you keep on kind of coming up with new goods and more complex goods over time. So if we're just sort of wondering how quickly we could scale up the humanoid bots, maybe something on the upper end of that range is more reasonable, at least, given those fixed parameters, right? Okay. And yeah, they have a range and they try, they plug in a whole range of different estimates. So that's kind of just like a, hopefully Overton window expanding set of BOTECs on how fast an industrial explosion could go. In principle, obviously there are many frictions that could slow down the process for a while, temporarily or maybe permanently, and Zach will share a few of those.
Yeah, so as Phil was saying, just a few words about temporary frictions that could affect how fast this growth explosion would be if we have full automation. So the first obvious thing to consider is that unemployment might boom in this world where there's actually full automation. Currently in the US, 60% of US household income is wages, and the replacement rate from unemployment insurance is about 43%. So there's just a welfare hit to people if that didn't change at all in terms of how much they're able to consume. Especially because given inequalities in capital ownership, for example, top 10% of net worth own about 91% of biz equity, large-scale automation without changing the tax and transfer system or the ownership of capital structure, would involve a lot of income loss for many households. They wouldn't be getting enough dividends from the minuscule amounts of capital they own to make up for their lost labor income. And as we've kind of discussed at earlier points in the course, if workers can't frictionlessly reallocate to remaining unautomated tasks, that's going to slow down growth on the transition to full automation. One way of thinking about how large that effect comes from the gate model, which we're going to talk more about on Monday, but is a model that takes seriously an AI investment boom that leads to full automation. And they allow you to switch between a scenario where, as automation is occurring, going from 20% to 100%, either you can have perfect labor reallocation where everyone whose job gets automated just goes into the remaining tasks, or you can have no reallocation where everyone whose job gets automated has no ability to reallocate into the remaining tasks. And in their central parameter estimates of that model, That's going to reduce annual output growth by about a half. So on the way to full automation, instead of growing at something like 30 to 40% per year, we grow at something like 10 to 20% per year. So it's a meaningful reduction in growth, but not like a outsized reduction in growth. That's a figure of the green line is their like main set of parameters where labor is able to frictionlessly reallocate, and then the magenta line is the no reallocation scenario. And it's a bit hard to eyeball these numbers, but this one's around 30 to 40. This one's about half of that until the point at which full automation is reached, where then they both start accelerating pretty rapidly. The only other point on this slide was that if you have the sort of J-curve dynamics that Eric talked about, that would slow growth but help employment, because you need to wait for the capital to get introduced in the right ways, and in the meantime, while we're waiting for that capital to occur, there's more things for workers still to do. Okay, and then another point that's been made by this less wrong post of Barkan is that you actually can have scenarios where automation causes growth to fall. He has a kind of simple model where automation temporarily reduces GDP due to the fact that as people's jobs get automated, wages fall, labor supply decreases, and the fall in labor supply causes a fall in output. This is a bit of a strange model because there's no capital accumulation. So when the labor supply falls, it's not like you get more capital replacing it to offset it. And it's a model where labor and capital are going to be perfect substitutes in the AI world. So I'm not sure it's a model we should put too much stock in, but it is, possible to get a model where you have automation occurring and growth falls. Perhaps something more, concerning that we should be worried about is something that Tomas brought up briefly in his lecture on Tuesday, which is this model from Baraja and Zorzi about inefficient automation. And their point is that automation can be inefficient in the sense that you have a Pareto improvement possible from implementing an automation tax and a labor reallocation tax. And the assumptions in the model are that labor reallocation is slow, households are borrowing constrained. So if someone gets fired, they're not able to fully borrow to smooth their consumption. In that period, they're unemployed because the labor reallocation is slow. And so there's that externality of that consumption loss the household is facing is not something the firm is internalizing. If you're able to tax automation while also taxing labor reallocation, you can raise the income of to-be automated workers in the periods where they would be borrowing constrained by slowing the automation process. And you can make the unautomated workers indifferent, since by making labor reallocation a bit harder, they benefit from less competition in their tasks along the way. So I think that's kind of an interesting point to be aware of. I don't think it's necessarily a big friction to growth acceleration, but something to be aware of. Another common concern we hear about in thinking about full automation scenarios is the impacts it would have on government finances. So, for example, existing tax systems tax labor more than capital. If now the economy is dominated by capital, you might think that it's going to be hard to raise sufficient government revenues. This is going to prevent us from being able to redistribute the transfers into households in need, and it might prevent us from being able to spend on public goods, which could directly slow down growth if you think infrastructure goods and other sorts of public goods are really important for growth. This Acemoglu paper finds, just to put numbers on it, that the effective tax rate on labor is about 5 to 6 times higher than the effective tax rate in capital in the US post the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And also, to be clear there, that's not just like the average wage tax or average labor income tax versus the average corporate income tax. In order to figure out the effective tax on capital, you have to pass through all the steps of when there's a corporate income tax or capital gains tax, how is depreciation being treated, and yada yada, to actually get the effective tax rate on capital. And so, one thing you could immediately say is, okay, well, this isn't going to be an issue because we can just raise the corporate tax if suddenly there's going to be all these capital profits. I don't think that's an obvious solution, because if there are tax havens and there's these super profitable AI companies, a given country is going to be very disincentivized from raising that capital tax and having the AI companies just, relocate, or at least for tax purposes, relocate to some other location. Furthermore, if growth is rising and interest rates are rising, which is something we've talked about a few times and we'll talk about more on Tuesday, that's going to be an increase in debt service costs, which is going to further strain fiscal budgets. Again, this might be worrisome for public goods provision. It also might be worrisome for financial stability concerns if you think suddenly the US is about to default on its debt or whatever. Pushing in the other direction is the fact that higher growth enlarges the tax base, which just mechanically is going to push down debt to GDP ratios. Also, there's more you could tax if you need to raise money. Seth Benzel, along with someone else, but Seth Benzel blogs about this in kind of more detail than the paper itself, analyzes a multi-country overlapping generations model. It's a bit of a strange model because they're not considering full automation scenarios. They're considering scenarios where by 2060, AI automates half of jobs. And the way the automation works there is not a task-based model, but firms facing two possible different Cobb-Douglas production functions, one with a higher capital share than the other, and endogenously adopting it based on the cost of capital compared to wages. In his model, in the US, the growth effects outweigh the interest costs and the tax reallocation stuff mentioned above, not being able to tax capital as much as taxing labor. So the US fiscal situation actually ends up better off, but in developing countries where there's less AI adoption due to lower baseline wages and higher capital costs, they don't get all these benefits of higher growth because they've adopted AI less. They don't get as much tax revenue, but they do still have to face the globally higher interest rates, and they have very severely negative budgetary effects. I think this is one very stylized model of how this could go. I actually think there's a lot of room for people to do more work on this, and aside from how it would impact growth, but work on optimal redistribution in these sorts of scenarios. There is this paper that Nathan Barnard tweeted out actually yesterday, which I just saw, that seems pretty interesting in this regard, where his proposal is for governments to issue lots of debt right now and buy up equity with that debt, with the idea being that if the capital share suddenly rose a bunch, the governments would now have this equity income that they could redistribute as a form of the government insuring itself against the budget consequences of full automation. So I think that's an interesting paper, but I think there's lots more that people could say under different assumptions about how a growth explosion would work, how that's going to impact public finances, and how that's going to allow us to redistribute it or not. There's also lots of regulatory responses to think about that we haven't talked about in any formal way, really. In the short term, we're likely to see, if automation starts really progressing, significant regulatory responses, whether that be to real or perceived, safety threats from having an AI in the work loop in some way, and that causing harms to people, bodily or psychological, whatever. You might also think just because liability law requires there to be a human in the loop, a lot of the time, we're not going to allow an end-to-end process to be automated without some human having to be liable. And I think evidence of the fact that we're likely to see these regulatory responses is occupational licensing is already quite widespread. In the US, it's estimated to be about 35% of jobs. I think it's pretty easy to imagine that could expand to a much higher number in a world where lots of jobs are truly under automation threat. And if we're concerned about preventing a rogue AI or democratic collapse due to people no longer having a stake in the economy or society, that might be justified. However, it is hard to imagine that these sorts of regulations could be sustained to permanently reduce growth. The only one country needs to deregulate for a growth explosion if you really believe full automation is possible. And it might be that right now other countries don't like extremely deviate from what the US wants them to do in terms of their regulation regime, because the US can impose lots of costs on them if they choose to do so. But in this world, the benefits of deviating from the US, what the US wants, would be much higher. So they might, go for it. On the other side, there are examples where it seems like there could be large benefits to deviating from international regulatory norms, but no one does it. For example, with cloning. So maybe the world actually would be able to just agree that we want to regulate this stuff. Again, all of this is likely to temporarily slow growth, but it's hard to imagine that it's going to permanently slow growth. And I think we've talked about this a bit before, but in the other direction, there's lots of ways you can imagine that AI is going to reduce regulatory burdens, speeding up permitting applications, regulatory reviews, and here's some example of environmental, housing, aviation, other housing stuff where that's ongoing. Finally, another argument for like a temporary friction to how full automation or partial automation on the way to full automation could cause a growth explosion is what we're calling Hayekian considerations. So the core argument of this famous Hayek 1945 paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society, is that production know-how is decentralized. You need trial and error and market competition to gradually uncover what needs to be produced. Like no one has the knowledge in their head of what is needed for the whole economy. They only know locally what is important for them to do. And as many people do this at once, that's what generates economic growth. And to be clear about, well, I'll say one more thing. Tyler Cowen has a post where he sees this, he claims this is a reason to be skeptical of both AI doomsters and AI utopians. I think the way of thinking about this is if you just, replaced all the humans in existing jobs with robots that cost 50% less than them, that's like a level effect to growth that occurs even in this Hayekian world. But you might think that growth from there on depends on these sorts of market competition processes that just take time to unfold, like to figure out what is the new product that people want that's going to generate more growth. That's not something, no matter how smart the AI is, if you really believe these Hayekian views, it just needs to unfold over time as like people try things and then people figure out, oh, this worked, this didn't work, etc. One piece of evidence for this view is that Clino and Lee have this paper where they estimate that in the US, historically, 60% of growth comes from existing firms innovating on their own products, only 27% from new varieties, 13% from creative destruction. And the sense in which that's evidence is that it's the local knowledge that firms have about their own products that is really driving growth. So you might think you need this really sort of tacit knowledge that's just well-defined relative to your circumstances to do new things that generate growth. But then kind of pointing in the other direction, we do observe that over time in the US since the early 1900s, corporate concentration has steadily risen. In early 1930s, the top 0.1% of corporations had 44% of all assets in the economy. By 2019, they had 88%. Rising concentration suggests that like one big brain can do increasingly important fractions of the output in the economy or figure it out just by themselves. And another kind of counter argument is, even if you think these Hayekian concerns are real, this is a point that Phil has made to me, you might think that if the AI is truly good enough, the robots could just like go off into the desert and like do all this competition themselves and then just send us the stuff that they've figured out is good. Anyway, if you kind of put all these frictions together, labor reallocation issues, budget issues, political instability, regulatory responses, Hayekian args, I think it's reasonable to believe that even once we reach the pure capability to fully automate the economy, we might not have explosive in the sense of greater than 30% growth in the short term. And I think it's worth saying that other than the labor reallocation, which like is explicitly modeled in the gate model, these other sorts of frictions really aren't captured in the models we're talking about. But even still, full automation would entail a prolonged period of dramatic growth, getting us to the point where the harder bottlenecks that we're going to talk about in the rest of this lecture become more relevant. And just to put some numbers on that, if you had 25 years of 30% annualized growth, we would be in an extremely different place. We would have greater than 1800x the current world product or US product. Yeah.
But the failed robots in the desert, how do they know what, like, they just happen to know what you like? And
yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's more to flesh that story out, but the idea is if they can fully automate for us, that presumably that means they have some knowledge of like what our preferences, like if you can fully automate for being a CEO, you have to have some sense of like what a human would want, whatever.
Just to clarify, if you go back to the previous slide, the way I worded it was if they're good enough at imitating human behavior, right? Which is different from like just being intelligent. You might think they won't get that good at imitating human behavior, but I think that's the condition.
And I think it's reasonable to say that like full automation comes with the ability to imitate human behavior in relevant senses.
Yeah, some relevant sense, but I think you could imagine drawing. Yeah, I think you could draw a line there. You could say we're going to have robots that are physically and cognitively capable of doing everything a person can do. I want to call that AGI and full automatability, but it's just not inclined to do exactly what we do. It's not going to demand exactly the same product, but is trying to imitate the human consumer. And that means that on its own, it's not going to be able to do the kind of natural experiments that entrepreneurs do when they kind of float new products and see what sticks. So you're going to have to run those social experiments on actual humans running at human speed, and that's going to be a bottleneck to growth. So I'm just pointing out that you need that difference, right? If the AIs are good enough at imitating human behavior, then you can send them off into the desert, and if not, then maybe you can't.
So Maxime pointed out over Slack that if the skills not replaced by AI are concentrated in developing countries, it might be actually favorable to them. Yeah, that's an interesting point. You know, if we all put on our glasses and collect all the training data that replaces the work that we do, and they don't have the glasses, then maybe there'll come a time when the tables are turned. It's interesting. Okay, so Zach went through a bunch of frictions on growth that don't appear in like standard models of AI growth that we've been thinking about or that other people have developed. Let's say though that sand in the gears is enough to, you know, slow down that hyperbolus that we only get 30% growth for 25 years. Is there audio coming out of here? I think, is someone on the Zoom call without being muted? If so, if you can hear me, mute. Okay. Then yeah, we'll be in a very different place at the end of that stretch, right? The economy will be 1,800 times bigger, and maybe some kind of more serious, more permanent bottlenecks could start to bite. The big three, which come out of the formula for like the super exponential versus sub-exponential growth threshold, will be the parallelizability, the natural resources, and the fishing out of ideas. Right now, I think if we suddenly moved to like full automation with like the current natural resource share and so on, we'd pretty obviously be on the super exponential side of the threshold. But we might not be in a world that had grown by a factor of 1,800. And let's go through how the parameters might change in the unfavorable direction. So first, on the alpha front, on the natural resource front, something we noted briefly in lecture 6 is that if you're going to not allow for any resource augmenting technology, that V, okay, that lets us do more with less land or less resources. If you're going to fix that, then the only interesting case of a natural resource constraint is the Cobb-Douglas one, because if it's harder than that, then you don't have sustained growth at all, right? You just have this hard ceiling imposed by the amount of natural resources, and it's kind of hard to explain the past of like a really long stretch of sustained growth. And if it's a growth substitute, then there's no constraint at all, right? But you can have it be a growth complement that's just continually being relieved by resource augmenting technology, right? So the share stays low, but that's because the effective quantity is growing. But that's the effective quantity grows because of technological development. So that's kind of one thing that can start to happen, which we'll dig into. The other is the hard parallelizability constraint, very analogous in a way, right? We're replacing Cobb-Douglas function, the Jones R&D function with the gross complements one. And we're finding that you get like a super exponential process for a while, but then you kind of potentially hit a ceiling, which kind of bottlenecks what the exponential growth rate can be. And then, of course, there's a possibility that we just like run out of ways to improve technology. We know from the biological limits that cap will be really, really high insofar as the technology that we care about involves having lots of copies of a given system. But even so, we might hit it, and we might actually kind of be constrained by technology of the kind that we care about, the spikes soon. Something variety related. Talk a bit about that in the next section. So on the resource front, suppose that this is our current production function, absent automation. All three factors are gross complements. The elasticity of substitution between energy or other natural resources and capital and labor are generally estimated to be less than 1, in fact, way less than 1, but over short horizons, but to increase with the horizon, which is at least consistent with the story that I'm laying out here. That at any given moment in time, they're gross complements. But if you just give it enough time, if we have a big influx of labor and capital, we eventually can we don't have a hard ceiling that we run into. So the marginal products of the labor and the capital don't fall so much. They certainly don't fall by half for every doubling of the capital and labor. But that's because the ceiling rises. Because the V, we kind of shift our technological development in ways that let us make do with fewer resources. Fewer resources per unit of capital. So let's say that's right. In this case, automating production will get us to this production function, right? Our tech is now all on K as opposed to L. You could put AK plus BL here, but in the limit, it can all be about the K. And so here you'll see Y is proportional to V. Just as in the case where labor is the constraint, Y is proportional to B. Here, Y is proportional to V. So technology is still necessary for growth. You can't just have robots building robots forever. At a given level of technology, we're not that efficient at building the robots. They're really resource intensive, and you can only build so many. And I'm not being like a environmental pessimist saying that there's only the really pessimistic view would be gross complementarity, and we can't really V. So there's like a limit to growth. This would just be a story where there's a limit to growth if we don't do technological development, but if we do new technological development, we can keep growing. But just like you don't get this like super exponential process of like baseline exponential because of robots building robots. And then on top of that, you got tech. No, tech is actually necessary. Now, I think a resource constraint of this form is probably far off. So let's say the growth rate of resource augmenting technology looks sort of Jones style. I'm just putting these hats on the lambda and the beta to denote that they can be different from the from the corresponding exponents in the labor augmenting technology case. Since the current resource share is so low, that, I mean, it doesn't literally imply, but it strongly suggests that we're a long way from the ceiling. And concretely, on the energy front, even fixing our current solar panel efficiency, we could more than 500x our energy consumption. Now, I mean, this is like literally if you tile the whole Earth solar panels. So like, yeah, maybe in practice it's much less than that. But note that this 500x is a lot lower a ceiling than what we saw before with the Davison and Hadshire point, because they were looking at like if we were using all of the solar energy hitting the Earth. And here I'm like fixing our current solar panel efficiency, right? But the point is like we need to raise V to use more energy. Yeah.
With the vision and here, why?
Yeah, yeah.
Uses like the cap.
Yeah, why is the sun the cap? Exactly. I'm going to get to that at the bottom, but I can get to it now. So the reason why you want to use this, so a reason why this might be too low of a cap on the energy front here, is that the sunlight band reflects. Ultimately, you think of reflecting constraint from heat dissipation. So I'm not sure why this is how the logic works, to be honest. Okay, but apparently, if we try like actually productively using more energy than we know that the Earth is capable of like absorbing from the sun and then dissipating without heating up, then all of that industrial activity will just sort of mechanically have to be heating up the Earth, even if we're not actually getting it from the sunlight. Like even if we just put like big black umbrellas around the Earth and then we just did a bunch of nuclear fusion and like we ran a bunch of machines that were, yeah, all the heat dissipation would heat up here. So yeah, but of course right now we can't do nuclear fusion, and nuclear fission is very expensive and politically difficult and so on. So maybe solar isn't such a reasonable practical balance. And this is all, yeah, separate from the greenhouse effect. I mean, it's kind of related on some level, but it's not as, I'm not talking about the greenhouse effect. So that's the energy front. You can think about what if we were trying to just, support lots of people, and we're going to think about like what current technology allows for there. If people lived at Paris's population density and the whole world was able to adopt and implement Holland's agricultural efficiency, we could support a population 10 times bigger than the current population. I should have actually spelled this out more, at like a developed world standard of living. I think that's right. You can dig into the details there. And when it comes to rare, is that wrong?
I know. I just feel like that's almost surprisingly low.
Yeah, I think they're trying to be really conservative because they're making the case that basically that natural resource constraints are not such a big deal relative to the positive externalities that people create for each other by coming up with new ideas. And so they're trying to be really conservative. But I couldn't find a better estimate of this this quantity. Like what if we all adopted like peak agricultural efficiency and urban whatever, all combined into one number. But yeah, I would be surprised if their attempt to like kind of steel man their case was not biased downward. Yeah.
Instead of like yummy consumption slide, we have like complementary like nature consumption and non-nature consumption. I can imagine like the heavy is getting like really grumpy about paving the road like Paris's population density. I'm like,
yeah.
Do we just like
well no. Most of the world's turning into like Holland style farms. Okay. Right? Not cities. The hippies will get grumpy at the farms replacing the wildlife. Yeah, that's fair. That would be another argument. If our utility functions just like require loads and loads of wilderness, right? That's going to That's going to lower the CAPS. And then people worry about rare earth metals bottlenecking certain kinds of industrial activity. And it turns out they're actually not that rare. They're plentiful in low concentrations throughout the crust of the earth. You just need a lot of energy to extract and refine them. So we start with like the really concentrated deposits in China, and then if those went out, then we move on to other deposits elsewhere. So but it's more like an energy constraint than like a pure resource constraint in that case. So the constraint is far off. And also, if you're wondering like whether we would be able to sustain growth in V through the process of like, more output being more capital, that's more bots trying to come up with more efficient use of resources. Kind of an interesting thing to note is that on some level, there's one of two things that has to be true. Okay. So if we've been historically allocating our R&D effort equally between the labor augmenting sector and the resource augmenting sector, if they're even separate at all, like suppose they were, then by a sort of extended Gonzalez theorem, K, DL, and VW all have to be growing at the same rate, except in the Cobb-Douglas edge case, of course, where the technology terms are all kind of equivalent. But let's say we're not in the Cobb-Douglas case. Then all the factors have to grow at the same rate for the shares to be constant over time. Does that make sense? If you have any gross complementarity, the faster growing factor is going to have its share fall over time. If you have any gross substitution, the faster growing factor will have its share rise. And since the factors across all three have been sort of roughly constant, sort of in the modern growth era, what that means is that BL has been growing at the same rate as VW. But BL's been growing both because V has been growing and because L's been growing. Okay? Does that make sense? We've been getting more people, we haven't been getting more land. Except for the colonies. So so let's say GB and GL have both been 2% or something, just for like a simple BOTEC. That means that GB has been double the rate of GB. Okay, which means that the like lambda hat over beta hat in the resource sector of technological development has to be double the lambda over beta in the V sector. So it starts looking more plausible. Like even if you think that the lambda over beta that you see from like a Bloom et al. Type accounting exercise is less than 1, you could still think that once resources become the bottleneck, it's just easier to relieve resource constraints than to relieve labor constraints. And so maybe we're on the right side of the threshold when it's all in, or tech progress is all about relieving the resource constraints. Does that make sense? See the argument? Okay. That said, this argument relies on R&D historically having been allocated equally between the two sectors. And maybe it hasn't. One kind of interesting thought from a recent working paper by yet another thing by Agyon et al., different from the other Agyon et al. 2025, is that maybe the shift to services that we've seen sometimes can be interpreted as like an endogenous shift from labor-saving technology to resource augmenting technology, because we're like choosing to shift our consumption to domains that require just as much labor as before, but fewer material inputs or something. And then maybe like the factor prices changing have like been partially responsible for the shift to service class. See, so that this would be a case of like, and the land over beta is the same in both sectors, but we've been pushing up the B as fast as the B, because we've been shifting over our effort from the B to the B. Yeah, a funny thing though is that if lambda hat over beta hat is less than 1, what that means is that, at least sort of absent full automation, all the growth in output per person that we've been experiencing has been transitional. It's been driven by the fact that the growth in research inputs, the growth in the number of researchers over time is faster than the population. And once it's constrained to be only as fast as, say, output, then growth will start being sub-exponential. I think you might just find that like implausible on its face or something, that like, if we had just fixed the fraction of people doing research over time, then like natural resources would have grown and grown as a share of GDP and slowed down growth. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what my own intuitions on that are, but that's an implication to notice. So that was the resources constraint, alpha basically not being constant, but falling towards zero unless continually relieved by new technology. I'll quickly say something about the other two, but again.
So just before you move on, the SUMF is constant search stale, and then
Yeah.
Other than that, I guess I'm thinking of some role as we used to have, like a substitution parameter. And
I'm not assuming CES necessarily. I'm just assuming gross complementarity.
Okay.
So rho could be bounded below zero, but it could have a different local value at different parts of the function.
I see.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
We talked a lot about parallelizability constraints yesterday, but that was all in the context of automating R&D alone. So briefly, what happens if you have that hard parallelizability constraint thing, but you're automating both sectors? Well, then there's a maximum rate at which A can grow. If you've automated production and you don't have the natural resource constraint, then Y equals AK, A is growing exponentially. That's a double exponential process. That's still super exponential, and it's basically completely compatible with all the Kramer stuff that we talked about this morning about, long run super exponential growth over time. Today is just not nearly good enough to distinguish a hyperbolic from a double exponential trend. If you have the natural resource constraint, so output in the long run is proportional to your rate of resource augmenting technology, then given constant research investment, the constant like S, then GY is going to be exponential, at least if it's, so in the like lambda hat over beta hat greater than one case where you can sustain exponential growth. The point is just like, well, without a parallelizability constraint, you get, unless you're in the knife edge case of it equaling one, then you're in the hyperbolic region. But then if you also have the parallelizability constraint alongside the hard natural resource constraint, then you just have exponential growth. There's just a maximum rate at which V can grow. And Y grows at that rate in the long run. Unless you send S to zero, obviously. And then just, wrapping up, going through the cases, if you have a really hard lack of technology type constraint, like if we just fish out the pond of ideas, if Y equals AK, so it's just robots building robots, and you've got no natural resource constraint, then given constant saving, output's going to grow exponentially. And that long run maximum A could be really high. Remember the octopuses. So it's not hyperbolic, but it's just exponential really fast. You're going to get stagnation in this case if you've got both the tech constraint on how fast the robots have, the capital augmenting technology term, how fast robots can build the robots, and you've got the natural resource constraint. Because that's, you kind of, you get maybe fast growth for a while, but then you only have so many resources, you use them as well as you can, and then you're done. You can't grow anymore. Right. y will equal v some maximum v, v bar. Could be really high. Remember the Davidson and Hatcher BOTECs, but the growth rate will be 0. Yeah, just kind of as an aside, BOTECs based on like what we know from biology or from physics is like possible as like a maximum level of technology. Theoretically, that's different from like the maximum level of technology achievable from our initial conditions right now. There might be no path from here to there, even if you know that there's a there. Right? Like there might just be nothing we can do with our hands to make a tool that helps us make another tool that autonomously makes a better tool that turns into something like an octopus that kind of replicates really fast. I think this is probably not an issue in practice, even though like theoretically it's a distinction to remember. Just some case studies or whatever you want to call them. There's the point that evolution managed to build us via random local modifications, even without foresight, right? You just had a whole sequence of organisms that were just randomly modified through some genetic mutation. And evolution wasn't even like thinking ahead and trying to like make some sequence of mutations which would eventually pan out to some smarter, more, well integrated system, more productive system. But just that sort of local optimization, very slow optimization one step at a time, managed to kind of get us all the way from the first little amoebas to ourselves, which is, it's kind of surprising. I wouldn't have guessed. Kind of similarly, gradient descent in machine learning, the way that like AI models are trained basically is that you kind of start with a random initialization of the parameters of a model, and then you locally tweak them in a direction that kind of better fits the data one step at a time. And that process can theoretically get stuck at a local optimum, right? Because if you had a local optimum, then any kind of tweak of the parameters will make things worse, even though like a big hop would lower the loss. And you can try to improve on pure gradient descent with this like annealing, this simulated annealing. Like every now and then you just make a big leap and just see how well it works out, and see if if the ball got stuck in a little dip on the hill, and it starts rolling down the hill further if you pop it out, as it were. But actually, usually just pure gradient descent, I'm told, works pretty well. So maybe kind of the iterative process of innovation. Our prior should be that it can get us all the way to sort of biological or physical possibilities. Anyway, those are the big three. Any thoughts? Any questions on those? Yeah.
Maybe it's too much of a macro thing, but I think I learned that I can do anything with the models. I can make them super exponential. I can make them hyperbolic. I feel like we need more input from physics, biology, computer science, etc. And particularly for this topic, rather than us saying, "Oh, if I posit a certain, BOTEC on this field, what happens or not?" Should we not turn to, I don't know, biologists or physicists, mathematicians to see if there are ends to these kind of discoveries?
Which do you have a question in mind in particular that we could get an answer from?
Maybe we talk about is a gonna bottleneck, or like can scientists collaborate together? In the end we can put anything in our sausage machine and this output function will give us some sort of growth we like. But I'm wondering, I guess we have a lot of criticism on economists, right? Because in the end we wave the hand and we can get a lot of results. And I'm wondering, should we not collaborate more with maybe physicists to see are there those bottlenecks that you talk about, or like those limitations to how the AI can automate research in their fields, etc. Does it make sense? Just because we were talking of the ends of a certain science field, I'm wondering maybe
the end of a field,
or like a cap of
a
bar of.
Oh well, I think so. It's you know, it's not like talking to biologists directly, but looking up what biologists have discovered, that I'm getting the number about the octopuses, and likewise, it's physicists that have figured out like how much sunlight hits the Earth and so on. I think if you wanted to kind of dig into that more, like what the kind of ultimate caps would be, then those. I expect it's a pretty narrow field, and most physicists have not thought about that. But if you know what question to ask, then you want to be turning to physics. I tend not to think that natural science is best suited to mapping out the space of like possible paths and thinking logically about like what constraint would be, what set of constraints is necessary to produce what like shape of like output growth or something. I think that's fundamentally an economic problem. But if you, I mean, you know, if you're wondering like whether I don't know, I'm just not sure how like biology or physics could help with like just
I'm saying maybe the limits of a belt, or how like super good AGI can change that the way that a dot's law of motion behaves. Maybe a physicist can answer better.
That's on the parallelizability question in particular.
Yeah, parallelizability, but also the BOTEC of physics, or like sorry, the innovation in general. Like that, what are limits on the a dot law of motion? Does it behave the same way as we have enormous improvements?
Yeah, okay, that's what I'm trying to do. So we're talking about using physics and biology to think about the ultimate limits, and we're using some computer science this morning, or sorry, yesterday afternoon, I guess, to think about what happens to the rate of progress in like various measures of AI progress if you just kind of scale up the capital inputs while fixing the level of technology. And there I was finding that you do hit those bottlenecks, like because of latency and so on. So I think I'm trying to do that, but if you think that there are questions that are important that I haven't touched on that computer scientists or whoever would know the answer to, then that's great. You can ask them and let us know. So yeah, so far in this lecture, we've been thinking about the like single good, you know, the Y equals yummy consumption sludge equals capital view of the world. And as noted a couple days ago, initially, so the very fact that we might want new goods, we might satiate in existing goods and not just want lots and lots of last generation bots, right? But be willing to sacrifice many of them for the first thing that can perform some new capabilities, some new consumption service. That itself could be a bottleneck to growth, at least to sort of GDP growth as conventionally defined. It'll be preferable to sacrifice lots of old bots for the one new bot or whatever. So it doesn't slow utility growth. The thing that would slow utility growth would be not doing that and just maximizing GDP growth by having lots of fast growing bots. But you can bottleneck GDP growth by new products. So Baumol's cost disease is not just limited to the phenomenon of like not automating everything and being bottlenecked by what you still need like people to do or whatever. To dig into that a little more, the idea is that new goods will constitute most of GDP precisely because they're scarce. And at least on some margins, you have gross complementarity between the new goods and the old. If you have this process where we keep developing new goods and creating the first copy or the first few copies is really inefficient. You know, it's really labor intensive or really capital intensive once everything's automated. And eventually they're growing hyperbolically, but they're only doing that once they're already so plentiful that their GDP shares are low. Then you're never going to have fast GDP growth. And you might wonder, okay, yeah, technically this is a thing that can happen, but can it really block even like hyperbolic growth? And weirdly enough, the answer is yes, and pretty straightforward. So here's the example I'll work through. And I'll just note, I kind of think that a model roughly of this form partially helps to explain the surprising constancy of frontier growth historically. This is part of that whole big paper with Chad that I keep referring to. But without getting into that, let's just look at how it works. So let's say the population is constant, we'll normalize it to 1, and that there's a continuum of like possible goods, like varieties, indexed by n from 0 to infinity. So this is our utility function. Remember this function? We saw it before. Utility rises toward a ceiling of 1 for each good, for good n. So there's a utility ceiling of n, and you just add up across the goods. Now, everything I'm going to say is going to hold, even if there's an upper bound on flow utility, because you can just wrap. We're not going to be thinking about intertemporal decisions at all. So you can just wrap each flow utility function in something else, right, which is upper bound. And what maximizes u as I've written it will be the same as what maximizes f of u for some upper bounded f. So even though the way I've written it, it's kind of like you can just keep on getting more utils, you know, 1 for 1 as you develop new goods. The point I'm making does not rely on that. Does that make sense? So there's some utility ceiling overall. Maybe if you wrap it in an F, and then you, as you get more and more goods, you asymptotically approach utilities. Okay, we'll say you've got a triangular production possibilities frontier. Turns out to make the math easier, if we normalize your expenditures at a given period to 1/4. So it's like there's only so many dollars, and like so nominal expenditures are just 1/4 of $1 million or whatever. And what I mean by a triangular production possibilities frontier is that how, like, to think about whether a given bundle is feasible, you just like divide the quantity of each good by how productive you are at making it and integrate across the goods, and that's got to equal your budget. So if there's 2 goods instead of infinitely many, if there's 2 goods, then the production possibility set will be a triangle, where the slope is governed by like the A of the one good relative to the A for the other. And we'll say that technology for each good grows exogenously. Like A dot equals A squared. So that's going to be hyperbolic, right? Because 2 is bigger than 1. Now here I have the input for the technology growth for a good, just being the technology level for that good. You could also like microfound this a bit more complexly by having a learning by doing model, where higher A for a good means higher demand for the good, and then higher demand means higher production, which means more learning. And then being the same thing. You can think of it good by good experience curves. Okay. But the way I've written it, it's not literally an experience curve. It's just like A just, grows in proportion to itself squared. And we'll just to make the math easier, we'll say that the starting technology level for each good, so it's level at time 0, is given by 1/n. Okay, so at time 0, it's feasible to produce every good. We're not necessarily going to want to buy a positive quantity of every good, but our productivity at making good n looks like this at time 0. So we've got that vertical aspect, but so it's good 0 is free, but every other good has a positive price at first. Does that make sense? This is A and at time 0. Higher index goods have lower productivity. At least at time 0. And you solve this differential equation, and it ends up reducing to the productivity of good n at time t is 1/n minus t. So at like t equals 5, if this is 5, then every good from 0 to 5 is going to be free. is like, our productivity making is infinite. But then beyond that, it's just 1 over n minus t. Okay. Oh, I put the thing down. Anyway, so we're going to consume an infinite quantity of goods up to n. So I'll provide like t utils. Like if at t equals 5, for n equals 5 and or lower, you get infinitely many of the goods. And then as for how to allocate the budget across goods n greater than t, hopefully it's like pretty clear by symmetry that whatever is optimal, like for how much to buy of all these goods, it'll just, whatever it looked for 0 on up at time 0, it'll look the same for goods 5 on up through time 5. Right? Because your preferences are totally symmetric across the goods, and the like curve of productivities is just what it was with all the goods re-indexed. So you're in the same kind of optimization problem at time 5 as you were at time 0, but you get those 5 extra yields as gravy. So to work this out, you can let I be a goods index above the highest index good in infinite supply at a given time. And it's a pretty simple, just take the first order conditions, and that's how much you're going to have to consume of good and at time g for some lambda, and then you subject it to the budget constraint. You find that lambda is equal to 1. That's why I had the budget equaling a quarter, because it makes it easy what the lambda is going to be, the margin utility consumption. And so the amount you consume of each good is going to be just a function of i's index above the current, the highest index good in the supply. So the share of good I just depends on its price and on its quantity relative to everything else, right? And so like the distribution of shares at time 0 look like this or whatever. The distribution of shares is going to look like that or something. And you work through it, and you get that real GDP growth is constant. And just to see why, like this is the distribution of shares. For goods that are indexed too high, we're so unproductive at making them that you don't even want to buy the first unit. Because your utility for each good, it just intersects the axis with like positive slope, and the slope's not high enough to make up to the fact that it's we're not very good at making it. So you get this distribution of shares, distribution of consumption levels, and then time goes on, and we have the same distribution of shares. And so the share weighted growth rates are just going to be constant. And this is true even though our quantity of any particular good is going to infinity in finite time. You might think of this as a model of books or works of art or something. In medieval times, books were actually really expensive to make. It's like a whole year's work to make a book. And so they all had positive prices, and but then once they're all just, you can just get the PDF online. The books are free, but we don't want like infinitely many copies of the same book. We can get it, but we don't. That doesn't. We get the utility of being able to access that book, and we just put all our effort into making the new books. And over time, in theory, we just discretely, once the book's published, its price sort of discretely falls. But let's say there's some learning by doing for books where like the first edition is expensive, and then we kind of very quickly get able to print it cheaply or post online cheaply. You kind of get the logic there. Yeah. Now, if the rate at which we can move to the right, at the rate at which we're coming up with new books in this model with this functional form, if that can itself explode, then you still get explosive GDP growth. So you need some kind of constraint, whether it's a parallelizability constraint or whatever, on the rate at which this hump is moving to the right. Otherwise, I mean, in the extreme case, you could get like infinite variety and finite time as well. But concretely, I think that there might be some constraints on how fast we can move to the right. Like if actually we're not thinking about books, but we're thinking about machines with different kinds of capabilities, even though like nanobots might be able to self-replicate really fast, human hands can't build a nanobot at all right now. We have to make some widgets which help us make the first bot, which make the first microbot, which make the first nanobot, and so on. And if GDP is always dominated by the bots that have been around for just long enough for their quantities to be pretty high, but not so long that their productivities and their prices are really low, then you just kind of get this long move to the right. Eric Drexler has this book in 1986 arguing that this process could unfold quickly in principle. So we have, this is kind of maybe getting at what you're saying, Berkay, like he actually digs into some of the physics here and argues that like, we have reason to believe that like, if we knew what we were doing with every second as we were like moving our thumbs around, it should be possible in principle to quickly create this cascade where like you build a bot, you build a bot, you build a bot, which gets us all the way to like molecularly precise manufacturing before a huge amount of time has unfolded. There's kind of a mark against this, a model of this form, slowing growth much. But we need to know what we're doing, right? So it might be that it takes time to figure out how to make that happen. So I think, yeah, lesson here is that due to the relative satiation in existing goods, which then kind of kills them as far as GDP is concerned, intensive margin growth, that is growth in consumption per person, not growth via population growth, can look a bit more like Y proportional to technology, not proportional to like technology times capital. The replication argument, as sort of simple and neat and compelling an argument as it is, I think, misleading also. Now, interestingly, you need variety growth for this to work out to be slow, but not zero. Because if we just cap varieties, right, then across this range, like everything is ultimately growing hyperbolically, a fixed weighted average of a bunch of hyperbolas is going to be hyperbolic growth, right? So if you have too fast variety growth, then you get fast growth, and if you've got none at all, then you get fast growth. It's a continual intermediate process of creating goods, having them grow slowly, and then having them to sort of exit GDP because their shares fall, is what maintains a constant growth rate. We might eventually run out of useful varieties, in which case we are in the case of basically a fixed range, because there's nothing more that we want to build. But the question is whether we run out of new varieties before or after we run out of efficiency improvements. Does that make sense? Because presumably like each AN is also capped, right? Like, whether it's at 100x or 300 million x or whatever Tom Davidson's range was, the Davidson-Hatcher range. If by the time this is fixed, we're at the cap, then growth moves slowly, this is the horizontal dimension, and then it moves slowly because we're kind of at the ceiling for each of the goods. That we're making. Okay, so we're over, and this is just kind of a really minor point anyway. But this morning, I just want to qualitatively point out that we talked about how, for like game theoretic reasons, some growth models predict that we have had and could in the future have way slower growth than is technologically feasible, because each innovator needs some profits. And the more general phenomenon I think that that's a case of is just, traps preventing growth. So you can have poverty traps. People write a lot about this in like development economics. Countries could just be locked in an equilibrium, a low growth equilibrium. In principle, you can have low growth equilibriums even after full automation. You here's one I haven't quite seen pointed out before, which is like an adaptation of Jones's empty planet model to the case of full automation. I think it's probably just a theoretical curiosity for all the reasons I think his original paper is also a theoretical curiosity. But the more general point might be a bit more than that. Okay. There's your recap slide, and see you Monday.